Okay, hi everybody. Thanks very much for having me back on stage. Earlier on, I was, you might have seen me, I was the moderator of a panel, and amongst the speakers was Jadwiga Milewicz, the entrepreneurship minister here in Poland. And she made a really interesting point about humanities as a field and relative to engineering, and this assumption that technologists are the most important people now, not necessarily the social scientists. And I'm going to try to make the argument to you now that, in fact, if anything, right now, the fields of philosophy and others of humanities are actually the most important of our time, precisely because of the technological moment in which we're leading. When I was thinking about this, I stumbled upon this quote by one of my favorite social scientists, one of the most influential of our time, Yuval Harari. Some of you have probably read at least one or two of his books, Sapiens being his classic. And he makes this point that essentially the philosophical framework of the modern world that was established in the 17th and 18th century, ideas of human agency, free will, all of that is now being challenged like never before. Not because philosophy is changing, but because technology is. This is a really powerful idea. Free will, human agency. This is the essence of who we think we are. And the idea that we are challenging that notion is incredibly powerful, but it's exciting, but also really quite scary. And to illustrate it, I started thinking about this classic hypothetical exercise from 1967. Philippa Foot, I'm afraid. She created this thing called the Trolley game. Some of you may have heard of it. It was a hypothetical situation. If you were in charge of a lever to control the movement of a trolley car, and you could see that there were 5 people about to be killed versus 1, what would you do? Would you pull the lever and make the trolley kill the 1 person instead of the 5? Well, the utilitarians would say, yes, of course, less lives lost. But then there's these participationists who say you shouldn't intervene in the fact. And then there's this notion of moral obligation, should you act? These are all hypothetical questions. We could engage in it from a purely hypothetical perspective. But I want you to watch this short video now.
Welcome to The Moral Machine, a platform for gathering a human perspective on moral decisions made by machine intelligence, such as self-driving cars. We show you moral dilemmas, where a driverless car must choose the lesser of 2 evils, such as killing 2 passengers or 5 pedestrians. As an outside observer, you judge which outcome you think is more acceptable. You can then see how your responses compare with other people. If you're feeling creative, you can also design your own scenarios for you and others to view, share, and discuss. Moral Machine is a project by the Scalable Cooperation Group at the MIT Media Lab. Help us learn how to make machines moral.
So that's a small little exercise at a lab, at the Media Lab at MIT where I work. And what I really like about it, aside from the fact that it is in this very straightforward voice, an accent like mine, laying out a set of simple questions, would you prefer to kill cats or dogs? It is actually really pointing out the fact that there's this big division as to what the answer is, right? So that little exercise is an attempt to explore the variety of opinions that are there about how we should rule this technology. These self-driving cars is just one example of the multiple ways in which technology is going to influence our lives, right? So, what we're trying to do here, and we hear this a lot, is make sure that humans are in control. We hear this, right? Make sure that humans, not machines. Ultimately, the human has to decide. But then there's this question, which human, right? What does it mean to be human? So I feel like the challenge of our age is to not only to protect, but also to define what is the human realm in this changing environment that we live in. So that notion of who we are and what we care about has to be a collective exercise. It's not just, okay, make sure that there's an ethics auditor in charge to ensure that the algorithm is acting in human interests. Because who's to say that that ethics auditor is defined by a set of ethics that belongs to all of us, right? We know from our political moment right now, and Poland is as divisive as any other country in terms of its politics, that there is a huge range of opinions about the way in which life should be defined and managed. And this becomes really important because there's this whole notion now within technology that tech itself is law. There's this phrase that Lawrence Lessig from Harvard came up with called Codas Law. And he was actually misinterpreted when he said that. He was really talking about the functionality of code, that it acts in a way that it governs us. He didn't mean that it should supplant law. But there's been a lot of mistaken understandings of that. In fact, I work in the blockchain space, and there was a company that was created on the Ethereum blockchain called the DAO. Some of you may have heard of it. It's a distributed autonomous organization, and it would make automatic investment decisions. And they wrote into the code that no outside law could supplant or subvert the actual code, that the code itself was the final aspect of law. And ultimately, the DAO got hacked, it got destroyed, and what did all the investors do? They went and tried to sue the company because they felt like this was their natural right, because the law is not code. The law is something that has existed with us for millennia. It's an expression of who we are as human beings. It represents our collective interest in what we see as the negotiated ethical boundaries of what we think society should be run by. This is really, really important because the fact is code can govern us. It does. It sets all sorts of rules by which we behave. That's what self-driving cars are going to do. It's what our smartphones do. All over the place we are being governed by code, but we cannot let it be the law. Right? So we need to create a framework in which we can establish the laws that can then manage and audit and control the algorithms that are controlling our lives. So I don't know if any of you have read this new book called The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. It's a fantastic book by Shoshana Zuboff. She's a Harvard professor as well. And I tell people if you're going to read it, have it with a stiff drink, because it's actually really quite scary. It talks about how we are already essentially living in the matrix, that we have an environment in which algorithms, secret algorithms, we need open algorithms, folks, but these are secret algorithms run by large internet companies, are mining our data, taking that data, and basically changing our behavior as a result of it, and then feeding new data into the system. So we are losing our free will. So I think we need a framework in which we can establish a set of laws to actually survive in this age of surveillance capitalism, the matrix, as I'm calling it. The first is that rules must assign human accountability. So we must know, who it is, what was built, and for what purpose it was built as it evolves, because AI, of course, evolves over time. Machine learning is essentially an evolving set of rules. So if we're going to establish a set of boundaries around which that algorithm should function, we need to be able to ensure that it is complying by those rules and what we agree to as it evolves. This is a difficult task. We need to know the provenance of code. Where did it come from, and how is it changing over time? What is its intent, its design, its purpose? And who is responsible for this? We need to fight software with software. So unfortunately, politicians, who are actually going to become more important, I would argue, those that set our regulations, the regulators, need to become engineers. They need to figure out how to use the code to actually manage the code. The integrity of the source data, so this is the human aspect of this, that's going into this, needs to be managed. I'm a believer in decentralized technologies like blockchain that allow us to ensure that the data is coming from multiple sources, not just from a centralized source. Ultimately, this all needs to be done within a balancing act, right? We heard all the wonderful things that AI could do in the healthcare sector, smart cities, all these things are really exciting. But we need to balance that potential for great innovation with the protection of human beings. There are lots of challenges that this poses. Algorithms are biased. There's a woman also at the MIT Media Lab called Joy Bulamwini, and she discovered that her face, she's Nigerian, wasn't being recognized by facial recognition technology that had white biases built into it. There's way too many people in coding who are of a white background, so we need more diversity in that. We need education so that people can learn to understand what code is. And we need transparency so that code is not just something that's obscure and difficult to understand, but can actually be human readable. Right? These are the challenges and the solutions that we need to confront. I just want to leave you, though, with the idea that there's another way to think about technology, and that is that we hear the term neural networks, and by that we typically mean artificial neural networks, computer nodes that function like human beings. But the reality is that we humans collectively, now tied ever more interconnected together, are also functioning as a large collective computer. We have this concept of the hive mind that social media creates. And this is just one example of that. And we need to celebrate this and explore that and build this aspect of what technology can do. That is to bring out our biggest and most powerful innovative ideas as a collective hive mind. This was the Our Place experiment on Reddit that allowed everybody to edit just 1 pixel of a picture, and with a 15 to 20 minute limit on whether you could then edit the next pixel. So it was a collective way to do art, and there were 1 million people who participated in this process. I don't know if I would call that a work of art, but it's an interesting expression of what humanity is when we collectively come together. I want to leave you with that thought, because I think that's the right way to frame how do we take advantage of this innovation and actually build humanity into technology as we go forward. Thank you very much for your time. Enjoy the rest of your conference.